Hello, welcome back to Radio Gorepress. I am your host, Sarah. Joining me as ever is my co-host, Philip. How you doing, Pip?
I am good. I am well rested, surprisingly. I've been trying my hardest to get a good night's sleep.
What's that like?
I know. Boring is what it is. It's boring. I want to stay up and watch TV and films.
No, I think being well rested is like the most... That's the most hype thing I can think of right now.
I think that's fair, to be fair, yeah.
What do the kids say? A good night's sleep. That sounds lit. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's something they regularly say.
Followed by a dab, right?
Yes, let's say yes.
What year
let's
is it?
Let's say yes and assume all the kids listening are, from 5 years ago.
No, we don't want children listening. This is not for children.
Okay, let's say all the kids we're referring to are from 5 years ago.
Okay, this show specifically is very much not for children, I'd like to point out.
Valid point.
How
are you?
I am slightly better than I was when we recorded the mini-sode. However...
I get the feeling that's going to change very quickly over the next hour and a half.
However, it's bound to deteriorate rapidly. Yeah. I'm going to level with you, Phil. I stopped making notes about halfway through this film because I lost the will to live.
My notes are the same. It's going to be an interesting episode. I think it's going to be a lot more of how we feel rather than specific moments of the film. That's my hope anyway.
I agree. We have many notes on the first half at least, so that's something. Now I'm going to hold my hands up straight out of the gate and say that this was my suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
So to Philip, to anyone who has watched this film in preparation for our show, I would like to express my deepest gratitude and apologise very sincerely. I'm very sorry I had to put you all through this.
There is justification in fairness. I think we've kind of noticed that perhaps okay. Cool. I'll let you take that then.
Well, I don't know. We've dipped into 80s schlock territory. We've done some more recent films. We've done some classic films. But one thing we haven't really touched on very much in the history of the show is video nasties.
Mm.
And I can't think of a more notorious video nasty than Cannibal Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we're going to dip our toes in, we might as well. We might as well just go for it.
You can't say if we're going to dip our toes in, and then follow it with we're going to jump right in.
Which is why I didn't say that, smarty pants.
If we're going to dip our toes in, we're going to just drown ourselves.
Yeah, we're just going to be submerged entirely. Yeah, which is kind of what we did. We went straight in. It wasn't a decision that was without regret. Interestingly, this was a second watch for me. I had assumed when I suggested it that you'd seen this before. What? Yeah, you told me the other day that this was a first viewing.
This is a weird film. It's always been...
It's a very weird film, yes.
Well, yeah, that aside. Cannibal Holocaust is one of those films that certainly every horror fan is aware of.
Oh, for sure.
So it's always been like kind of percolating around in my head. And I've always had an intention to watch it, but I've just never particularly felt the desire to.
Yeah, because you're not a sadist.
Well, exactly. And knowing kind of when you suggested it, it was like, oh, that's actually a good opportunity for me to, because then two birds with one stone, I get to tick off a film that I've not necessarily been wanting to watch, but meaning to watch.
Yeah. I think you phrased it. You phrased it quite well in the message that you sent to me. It's a film that you felt like you should have seen.
Yeah.
I think the thing that surprises me the most about it is your affection for the found footage genre. Because this is sort of considered, it's often called, I can't remember who coined the quote, but it's often called the Grandaddy of cannibal films. But it's also often credited as being one of the first found footage films. I think that title I don't know. There's some conjecture over that, but it's certainly one of the first that popularized the found footage movie in the context that we know it now. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I'm perhaps getting ahead of myself, so I wasn't expecting to be sort of talking about this so soon. But
well, it's fine. We can put that off till later. We can put that off till later if you'd like.
Yeah,
I can.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point though. It's a fair point. Like, I am a fan of the subgenre, but I think, to me at least, the found footage aspect also all kind of took a back seat to the cannibal angle, and I think that's what's kind of what I wasn't particularly excited to, actually watch.
Okay,
that's the aspect.
So
I guess.
So that was your like preconceived notion before watching the film, that you thought it was sold more on the cannibal angle and less on the found footage.
Yeah, like I knew it was a found footage, and actually found footage in the more traditional definition, in the sense that it's
quite literally
lost footage that has been recovered, both within the film and also kind of distributed, or fictionally at least, at the end, as if it had been rescued from destruction. So yeah, like I'd been aware of that. I didn't realize it was a film of two halves. It was almost exactly a film of two halves. Yeah. So that was quite an interesting thing to be sort of working out as I was watching it. Okay.
Well, before we get stuck in too much, I'm going to go in there with a synopsis, because like an idiot, I own this on DVD. I'm kidding. There's a lot of people who hold this film very dear to their hearts, and I hate it, but I will talk about why I hate it, but why I also have like mad respect for this film at the same time. I'll probably never watch it again though. I'm gonna be straight with you. So the Shameless DVD that I own has quite a lengthy synopsis, so I'm just going to give you the meat of it, so to speak.
Pun intended.
Pun very much intended. Thank you.
I expected it was.
So, anthropologist Harold Monroe is hellbound as he travels into the green inferno of South America's rainforest in an attempt to find a documentary crew lost months before. Instead of survivors, he discovers a world of cannibalistic excess beyond his wildest imaginings. But when he returns home and screens the footage left behind by the eviscerated filmmakers, chaos erupts as the screen is filled with some of the most disturbing images ever committed to celluloid.
Ooh.
I mean, I would probably agree with that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think it's one of those films that, like, I had seen this before, but the first time I saw this was at least 15 years ago. And it was at a time where, in fact, probably longer than that. What year are we in now? So Vitco acquired it in 2001. So it's been available a lot more freely in the UK for 20 years.
Yeah, because it was banned prior to 2001.
Well, okay. Let's get in there with some facts and figures, shall we? I actually had a quick squiz at the BBFC's website, because you can look up individual titles, and it kind of gives you a little bit of history about the classification. And I was really interested. And something I did not know until I was today years old is that you didn't need a BBFC classification in order to release a film.
Oh, okay. Okay, so it would be unrated then.
So it was released on home video and it was available. And more troublingly, it was available to anyone. It was available to children because it was devoid of a rating. Yeah. That was kind of I had assumed that if you wanted to put your film out into, a cinema or even just the home video market, that you had to submit for certification, but apparently it was optional back then.
Huh.
Okay. So, it was actually released with very little fanfare. And it wasn't until later that it started to kind of gain a little bit more notoriety. And the term video nasty obviously was coined in the early 80s. Well, mid 80s perhaps. So I thought that was quite interesting. I didn't know that.
No, me neither. And from what I read, it's was released with about 15, 16 minutes worth of cuts. That was when it was classified. It was kind of categorized as a 18, I would assume.
Was it as many as that? I knew they demanded quite a lot of
and
edits.
then it got another approval in 2011, I think. That had about a minute's worth of cuts. So it actually had footage added back in. It was resubmitted and released with more footage in than previously.
So what's the one I've got now then? Is this still considered cut?
I believe so. I think there's.
Oh wow!
I don't think. Oh, I don't know. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't had a full release. Certainly, classified release.
Yeah. God, I'd be so interested to know what was still missing.
I think from what I've gathered, it's a lot. There aren't scenes missing. It's just kind of individual shots, or perhaps shots that go on a bit too long. It's just things being shaved off here and there. So I don't think you actually miss the bulk of anything. There's no like plot development that happens. It's just shots that perhaps linger too much or are a bit too graphic, particularly of the animal cruelty, I think.
Yeah. So on that note, I want to come back to that. You said nothing that interferes with the plot. And it is a film that has a plot. And I think it's sort of unfairly written off as nothing but shock.
Yeah. This is what I realised watching. There's a whole... And indeed, it was kind of conceived as a reaction to genuine journalism that the director, Ruggero Deodato, thought had been deliberately sensationalized and also kind of and perhaps recreated for dramatic effect. And he made it as a bit of a critique of that, which I thought was quite a surprise.
Okay.
Because like you say, I'd written it off as being like, it's just like 80s schlock. But actually there is underneath everything, there is a message that's trying to be kind of put out. I mean,
like even the tagline on the edition of the film that I have is just the most controversial film ever made. Which I would argue that a Serbian film is far more controversial, to be honest. In this day and age anyway.
Yeah.
But I mean, Cannibal Holocaust does still retain the power to shock, but I don't know if I would call it the most controversial film ever made, unless that's in reference to its history.
Maybe. I think films like that would benefit from ironically sensationalizing the controversy aspect. So of course they're going to go, you can't quantify like the most controversial film ever. it's or at least it would be hard to, right? So they may as well just say
Karen in Basingstoke.
Yeah, exactly. So they may as well just say it's the most controversial film ever, and then all of a sudden that's massive hype.
Can't refute it.
Right, exactly. Or it would be difficult to at least.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also, like, I'd read the same thing that you had about, I believe it was Deodato's son who was watching the news. And he saw that and kind of came up with the conceit of this film off the back of that. And so, in terms of messaging, I'm not going to skip right to the end, but I think it's impossible to ignore from the get-go that this film has a message.
Yeah.
And I admire that. I think it's achieved, but I also think it's kind of heavy-handed.
Yeah, I think I agree, but also I think it's a little muddied as well.
Okay. Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
So it's because like from the get-go, my first note was in inverted commas Green Inferno, which I caught like as a kind of obviously influences from Eli Roth there for his film.
The alternative title for Cannibal Holocaust 2 was The Green Inferno.
Yeah. But then it was intercut along with shots of the city and people in the city and kind of the juxtaposition of this kind of like talk of savages and the urban jungle, it almost immediately I was like, oh, is that the angle they actually go? Is that the angle they go for? Is that actually the civilized society are the actual savages, you know? So yeah, like there is that clear message, I think, right from the start, or at least seems to be a clear message right from the start.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, I kind of love that bit with the newsreader. I love that newsreader voice. Man is omnipotent. I love that. I love it. So the script is not great. That's one thing I will say. I think the script is a little bit heavy-handed. The script is a little bit hackneyed. It's one of the weaker things about the film. And that's probably all I'm going to say about the script. Also, before we get too deep into this, I do want to say that I watched the newer director's edit of the film. But to my knowledge, the only things that were removed were a lot of the animal cruelty. There was still a fair bit on display. Yeah,
of course, yeah.
And we'll talk about how G-dang upsetting that is a little bit later on. In fact, I'm sitting here with a hot Vimto because I need something comforting to talk about this film. It's so sad. I'm so middle-aged right now. But yeah, to my knowledge, the director's edition is just... Because that was... it was prefaced by a kind of foreword by Ruggero, Deodato, and he kind of said, like, his only real regret in making the film was to include so much animal killing.
Oh, okay. So I watched it on Prime, and no such foreword existed.
No.
But I since heard, like, going through kind of IMDb and such, I've heard that he regretted it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Whether or not that is true, whether or not that is... Well, I suspect it is true, because I was about to say I'm not sure if that's in reference to some of the criticism he received, but he seems so staunch in his defense of everything else in the film that I feel like that would be a weird hill for him to die on.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing it is probably something that he regrets in hindsight. I think he said at the time, because obviously they found ways to simulate the violence against the humans, so he wishes there'd been a way to simulate the animal killing as well.
Of course, yeah.
And there's stories as well about, like, apparently one of the actors cried after one of the scenes.
I mean, okay, I may as well just say it, but it's stuff like that I feel muddies the message, because the whole thing, the whole angle about it is how directors can sensationalize footage to make things seem worse, and you would expect that a film about such things they'd be at least cognizant and aware enough to take steps to try and mitigate the actual mitigate how tough the actual shoot is. And there's all sorts of stories, the animal cruelty, the kind of sex scenes, like there's loads of stories of how the treatment of the actual indigenous people of South America. Like, there's so many stories of how rough a shoot it was, and I feel that muddies the message, because how can you kind of create a critique of kind of false construction of films and movies, whilst also
when you're doing it for real,
being guilty of the same thing, you know?
Yeah. It's difficult, isn't it? Because it's multi-layered, and I appreciate why the animal cruelty and the killing is present. I wish it had been simulated. I wish it had been faked, but I understand why it's necessary. And one thing that I'd forgotten between my initial watching of this film and seeing it again this week is I'd forgotten how much of the animal cruelty and killing was perpetrated by the camera crew. By the Americans.
Almost all of it.
As an adult, almost all of it. As an adult, I now see that is there to sort of draw parallels and to say, like, they're doing it and they don't need to do it, whereas the indigenous peoples are doing it because they are using the parts of the animal. They are eating, they consider, like, monkey brains to be a delicacy.
Yeah.
So it's a really difficult thing to talk about. You all know I'm a vegan. I'm not one of the preachy ones. Give me a break. But I think watching this film is how vegans feel a lot of the time in terms of animal treatment and animal death. I think that's the best thing I can say about that. But I can understand it if it's... I hesitate to use the word primitive because that sounds derogatory.
Right.
But I can understand in different cultures where they don't have the options that we have in the developed Western world. I mean, I'm more open to people hunting animals if they are going to eat what they kill and use the there's no waste. There's a reason for it.
And there's an honesty there as well.
Far more. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I can get behind that far more. But the Americans seem to do it for fun.
Yeah, there's the turtle that they
do
eat.
I hated that.
But the tarantula and the snake kind of narratively, defensively, but they didn't need to show it. Like,
at least one monkey dies. Oh, the pig.
Yeah.
The piglet. That was horrible.
And the actor, I can't remember his name, fluffed his monologue after that because of feeling so distraught about it.
Yeah.
Bless him.
Yeah, so, I actually read there were threats of walkouts if they didn't cool it on the animal cruelty. But contractually, none of the actors could actually follow through on that.
Oh, okay.
But again, there's a lot of stories surrounding this film. There's a lot of trivia, and I'm not sure. Like, I've been taking some of it with a pinch of salt because it sounds a little bit... The way it's worded makes it sound like it's been made up. And obviously on IMDb, people can submit things themselves. Of course, yeah. So, but, largely these stories are pretty widely talked about. So I think the bulk of them are probably true.
Yeah. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
I do think that was interesting. I'm not going to talk about the animal cruelty too much because that's not the point of this episode and it's not the point of the film. But
no.
Yeah. So obviously we start off with some aerial shots of the jungle and some relaxing music.
Yes.
At which point it's just like, oh, what a lovely travelogue this is. And it's such an overused technique to try to lull the audience into a false sense of security. Mm-hmm. But I still fucking love it. I'm such a sucker for that.
It's great because it's not just that. But if memory serves, that bit of music is used throughout, juxtaposed against some really horrific visuals. Uh-huh. And that... that's a really kind of clever way of doing it because it creates this kind of like cognitive dissonance in the audience's mind because they're hearing this music that they've become familiar with and maybe quite enjoy. Yeah. And all of a sudden it's being jammed up against these really like horrific images.
Yeah. It's like, no, you're not allowed to enjoy the lovely thing anymore. Sorry. I do think the music is a really interesting choice. I quite liked some of it, even though it was a bit like... There's a little bit of soft porn in places. But I do think that was such... that the choice to include music like that is so of its time. Yeah. Because there's two things that it really made me think of. One I might be misremembering, but one of them is Carrie. That opening sequence where it's all dreamy and she's in the shower and then the music is quite similar. And I think that was like, 76? I think Carrie was 76. Yeah. And then the other thing it made me think of was Last House on the Left. Okay. Not the music that we have mocked on occasion. Oh no! I'm going to get to that in a second.
I wouldn't have sung that had you not mentioned it.
No, you're not pinning that one on me. No way. You can thank Phil for that earworm. But yeah, I don't know if I'm misremembering because I haven't seen this film in a very long time. But I seem to remember at the start of the film, when the girls are getting ready to go to the concert, it's similarly sort of calm and dreamy and quite similar musical choices. And And the only, weirdly, so I don't know if there's a connection here. Last House on the Left came out before this did. And the only other Ruggero Deodato film that I have ever seen is The House on the Edge of the Park, which stars David Hess.
Okay.
And I wondered if perhaps that Deodato had been influenced by Wes Craven. Like,
maybe.
You know.
I mean, I think it was... I'm not as familiar with the films of that era, but certainly it didn't sound like an 80s movie.
No.
And I think that's a good thing in terms of the angle it was going for. It did give it a more kind of not necessarily authoritative, but it made it seem more serious, I suppose. It gave it, you know what I mean?
I do. And I think it's just nice to watch an Italian horror film from that era that's not soundtracked by Goblin. As much as I love Goblin, you can have a little too much. That's all I'm saying. It just made a nice change.
For sure.
I did think it was quite funny that there was some very, very heavy-handed foreshadowing when you see the group of reporters. And I think one of them literally says, providing we come back in one piece. Like, oh no, my guy, my dude.
If only you know.
I mean, it's such obvious wording as well, but I don't know. I quite enjoyed that. And there was a lot of like, look how savage they are, but who are the real savages? And I think perhaps it was a little bit overdone in places. But let's move on from that. So there were quite a few scenes, particularly in the first half, of just the jungle and animals in the jungle. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing some of that was stock footage.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. There's that odd scene of a leopard seemingly stalking. Well, yeah, like stalking some spider monkeys. Sorry, squirrel monkeys. And then being shot at, I believe. But I can't imagine... It didn't seem authentic, you know. It did feel a bit stocky because the squirrels could just run up trees, you know, if they felt genuinely threatened. And I can't imagine a leopard would hunt out monkeys that are the size of a football, you know.
You never know. Depends what that monkey had done.
I'm not that particularly familiar with the diets of leopards, but...
That monkey might have really pissed off that leopard for all you know.
Maybe.
We'll never find out. That will forever remain a mystery. Oh, God. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about it, and I really don't want to. Because it's my least favourite bit, or... No, least favourite makes it sound like it's still a bit favourite. It's the worst part of the film for me. I'd forgotten just how much rape there was in this film.
Yeah. It's a really uncomfortable watch.
There's so much. Like rape after rape after rape. And it gets mentioned when people talk about this film, it gets mentioned, but I'd forgotten just how prevalent it was. And it's like the indigenous people raping each other, the reporters raping indigenous people. Like it's just, it doesn't end. It's that to me was the most horrific part.
Yeah. But again, that all points towards the idea of the message being muddied, because we find out in the second half that the documentarians have been sensationalizing it and twisting the story to make a more dramatic narrative. But then at the same time, in real life, these indigenous locals aren't at all being portrayed in an accurate light, and presumably are doing things that have been sensationalized. So again, like, how can you make this film that critiques increasing the drama of a narrative when you're doing it yourself, you know?
Yeah,
it's a shame, because it's a fair message, and it's a good one to kind of explore.
But you just think he undermined his own message too many times.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many unnecessary things. There's so many things that were purposefully done in a more dramatic light, in a more horrific light.
I will say that first rape scene, the sort of ritualistic punishment one, that is perhaps the most uncomfortable I have been watching a film in quite some time. I would rather sit through the turtle death than that again.
Yeah. Is that
which is saying
the one on the
something.
riverbank?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was horrendous. And you don't, like, nothing about this film, despite what you may have heard, this film, I don't think, is that explicit compared to some films that are on the market now. In terms of gore.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I think, again, it's one of those things that points to how kind of how kind of familiar audiences are these days. Because
or desensitized, maybe?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, because yes, it's gory, but you look at it with a familiarity of modern films.
Yeah.
With all the special effects that we can do now, whether computer generated or practical.
Yeah.
And, you can see what they're doing and how suspect it looks. Like there's the whole scene where one of the characters is kind of having their chest torn open, I think. Yeah. And it just looks like they've put a little bit of prosthetic over the top and just painted red.
Yeah. When they're kind of like sawing.
Yeah.
Up and that looks so fat. But this is it. I think I made a note somewhere, like, it surprised me how much this film is praised for its effects work, because I think largely it's crap. Genuinely speaking. And I think it's really surprising to me then, obviously, as the stories go, Deodato paid his principal cast to effectively disappear for the next year after the film's release, in a move that was kind of copied by Blair Witch, to make unsuspecting audiences believe that the actors had actually died. And that came back to bite him in the arse in the form of a court case.
Yes.
Obviously, he was able to prove that they hadn't actually been killed, but it blows my mind to think that anybody watched that and assumed it was real. Yeah, that anybody thought that was a snuff movie.
But then, like, it's all very well and good saying that, but I think we have access to a lot more information these days, and are perhaps more able to kind of judge things in a more accurate fashion, I suppose. I don't know, maybe.
I guess so. I think just purely in terms of the effects work, though, it surprises me that there was ever an audience that sat down and thought that what they were seeing was real. Yeah,
I mean, I feel the same. Like, I'm just trying to kind of work out why that might have been the case.
No, I understand. Like, context is really important, and you have to put yourself in the mind of an audience from 40 years ago, and that's not
because
easy to do.
All these films have been banned, and they were banned for a reason, because for similar, and so audiences didn't have access to seeing these sort of prosthetic, these sort of special effects, and therefore anything that they did see was perhaps the worst thing they'd ever seen.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I guess if you've never seen an actual human being sawn in half, then you've got no basis for comparison.
That scene, yes, iffy, but certainly like the whole impalement scene at the end, the famous one.
I genuinely think that's brilliantly done. That's one of my favourite parts of the movie, to be honest, I think. And it's understandable why that became such an iconic bit of imagery and why they kind of marketed the film with that image. I think it's memorable as heck.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like I'm amazed actually that I'd forgotten so much of this film, because I feel like I was at an age, it was a formative enough time for me that I feel like it should have really fucked me up.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's just because my friends at the time were kind of seeking out things like Faces of Death and trying to find the most extreme films possible, that perhaps there was so much of it available at that time that it didn't have the same impact.
Maybe.
But that surprises me. Because it does still retain the power to shock, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. So what about this film do you think makes it so disorienting? In terms of kind of visual choices, and we've talked a little bit about the not anachronistic, you know what I mean? The music perhaps being a bit off kilter.
Yeah. I think, and I know we kind of said we'd move away from it. I think knowing, because obviously I had the foresight. I knew a lot about this movie before going in. But despite that, and despite knowing it's a legitimate film and it's all fictional and so on and so forth, it's really hard to, because there are genuine killings in there, like animals genuinely die.
Yeah. It's
really hard to separate the boundary between real and fiction. You know, it was Lloyd Kaufman pointed to the works of Vsevolod Pudovkin, who was a Russian filmmaker, kind of a contemporary of Sergei Eisenstein. But he's famous for his...
I know some of those words.
He was famous for his work on montage. And the idea of like how kind of scenes butting up against each other can create meaning.
Yeah.
And so because of that, because you're seeing these actual genuine deaths in a movie next to fictional deaths, there's again that cognitive dissonance, even though like in a rational state of mind, you know what's not real and what is real.
Yeah. But, so do you think like it's done in such a way that it's just enough to create doubt, unease?
Almost, yeah. Even if you are familiar with the film as a work of fiction, and the same almost goes to the indigenous people, because from the sounds of it, they weren't treated particularly well. The scene of the hut being burned down, like again, pinch of salt maybe, but they were forced to stay in that hut a bit longer than they should have done.
Yeah, I did wonder about that actually.
And it just brings into question the filming practices that went on behind this movie.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider.
That's really why it is uncomfortable to watch, because again, it's, you know, that the actors were going through rough times, both Indigenous and sort of the Western or the kind of Caucasian actors.
So basically, you know it's fake, but is it really?
Yeah, and again, like, yes, I know it's fake. Yes, I know it's fake. But there's just
is it?
Yeah, I think that's the real reason that I struggle so much, because again, like, I know I've watched enough films to be able to tell what's not real and what it, you know. But despite that, there's just that doubt, you know.
No, I would agree with that. I wonder if perhaps in that respect then that it's, to some people, might be more shocking now, because stylistically and thematically it's just a little bit different to the films that are coming out now. So it might even swing the other way for some people seeing it for the first time in this day and age.
Yeah.
I will say, I think some of the things specifically that made me the most uncomfortable is they utilised a lot of close-ups, obviously shaky cam because it's found footage. They utilised a lot of intense kind of close-ups. There was a lot of like chanting and just sort of almost like a white noise was created, but the opposite of the kind of white noise that makes you calm.
Yeah.
if that makes any sort of sense. Just, I don't know if it's a personal thing, but just something about people's voices, people shouting over one another and not being able to discern what any one person is saying. I find that so unsettling.
Yeah.
Because it sends me into fight or flight. It sends me into panic mode.
And I guess not only are you having multiple people screaming in English, but also, I guess, people screaming in the language of the indigenous people of South America.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the nudity was utilized quite well in order, because I mean, we don't walk around naked.
Yeah.
But a lot of Indigenous people do. A lot of, tribes that we've never even heard from or seen, they don't give a fuck.
Mm.
And, more power to them. # free the nipple. I'm on board for it. However, because it's not a custom of ours, it's really unsettling to see so much, like, they're just going about their day but without any clothes on. Do you know what I mean? It's weird, Phil. Yeah. But I think that's another thing that kind of just adds to the level of discomfort that the audience is intended to feel. And I get that that's perhaps coming from a place of, I hesitate to say racism, but perhaps, I don't know,
it's hard not to, it's hard not to view this film particularly, or films like this, it's hard not to view them through a Western lens, because that's all we're familiar with. And unless you've spent time looking into other cultures and looking at the customs and being familiar with that, it's going to seem jarring. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just what we've grown accustomed to.
Yeah, it's just different.
Yeah.
And it is odd to see that on screen, I think. Especially, I think it would have been fine if everyone had been naked. But because the reporters weren't, and they were kind of mingling with the Indigenous people, that's what made it more odd.
Yeah.
When people are present and they're fully clothed, it makes the naked people look even more naked.
It's like when someone's naked but wearing socks, they're
from
somehow
no.
more
if
naked.
If they're just naked from the waist down, that makes somebody look. I hate that term, but yes, that makes somebody look way more naked than if they were wearing nothing. And I do not have any time for it. Make it go away. No. With that in mind, though, in terms of race, it's a tricky subject. It's a touchy subject. More now than ever, arguably.
Yeah.
How do you feel? Do you think there was racism evident on screen? Do you think there was racism perhaps in the making of the film? I'm curious to know how well they were able to communicate with the Indigenous people, to be honest.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, like, we know it's fake, but is it fake?
Yeah.
How much of it were they aware of?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that again, that points to that blurring of the line between what's real and what's not. Like, you have these people who are acknowledged to be actors from the culture they're portraying, accurately or otherwise, inaccurately from the sound of it.
Yeah, that's largely what I've heard.
Yeah, therefore, like you say, where's the communication? How much do they understand it? It feels, without knowing the specifics of it, it feels like it could be really exploitative.
I think it probably was really exploitative. Because, I mean, what are they aware of on any level? Like, how do you say to these people, this is for a film? Yeah, all right, what's a film?
Then, are we being like totally white saviors about this? Because, maybe we're, just because someone chooses, just because, for example, a group of people choose to live in a rainforest, it doesn't mean they're not familiar with how other people live. Like, there's levels of seclusion in these situations, and
I agree, and I don't necessarily think it's like a white savior thing that comes into it. Maybe it's ignorance on my part. Maybe I'm not affording them as much knowledge as they may have. I think it's a really good advert for just leaving people the fuck alone to get on with things. Do you know what it really made me think of? That story that hit the news a few years ago, that the Christian missionary that got in a boat and tried to go to a notoriously secluded tribe on an island to convert them to Christianity, and they killed him. If that isn't the best advert for Darwinism, I don't know what is. Just leave everyone the fuck alone.
Mm-hmm. But then I think like I said, I think there are levels of it, because there are cultures like that do seclude themselves, but
yeah,
you know, there are other cultures that choose to live away from kind of society as we know it, but at the same time don't necessarily. They still will perhaps, you know, wear clothes they're familiar with, or you know, something.
Yeah.
And without knowing exactly how those tribes live, it's so difficult to know.
Yeah.
How much of it was sensationalized, which again points to the message being blurred.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm guessing. I guess what you're saying is just because they don't have Wi-Fi doesn't mean they're backwards.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what they're pointing to, you know, to a certain extent.
So I guess that's kind of in line with what you were talking about earlier, in that is, again, something that sort of undermines Deodato's own message. Because the message sort of seems to be, you know, we're all the same. We're all savage in some way, no matter whether you live in a hut or a tower block. But equally, some of the message, to me at least, seems to be just like, live and let live, leave alone, don't interfere. But what they're doing in order to make this film is interfering.
It's interfering, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah. It's tough, isn't it?
It's really tough. It's really tough. And particularly knowing it's considered a schlock movie from the 80s. You know, had it been made today...
I don't know that it is. I think in mainstream circles, I think it's got a really bad reputation.
Yeah.
But I think amongst horror fans, a lot of people will call this like a straight up masterpiece.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to lie, I don't necessarily think they're wrong. I also don't necessarily think it's a film that should ever have been made in the same breath.
But sorry.
It's very hard to live with that contradiction in my own head.
I can imagine. But like, had it been made with today's... Because I'm not saying it would... Like, a film like that could be made today if there was a market there. But
in what sense? In what sense? What do you mean? Well, like, a film like this could be made today, but do you mean like in terms of... where it was shot, who it was shot with, like, or
yeah, well, not in like you'll never see a film like that made today, like not in that sense. Yeah. But I think had it been remade, whatever, I think there could have been a higher awareness of what was going on. Yeah, the kind of cultures they were approaching. Yeah, and they would have done it. They could have done it a bit more sensitively, I suppose.
Yeah, so you're saying you can just hop on the internet and read up about the people
for example,
X South American rainforest, and then no, that makes sense.
But because it's from the 80s, I can't help but feel that sort of research didn't happen, and maybe that's just an assumption on my part. You know, particularly since it deals with an actual a character who is an anthropologist. You know, that you would have thought they might have done a bit of research, but it's hard to know. It's hard to know what's been fictionalized and what's based in reality. You know,
it is really difficult as well because I've seen a couple of interviews with Deodato, and he made the film, so obviously he's going to speak very highly of his own work, and he's going to make lofty claims about what they aim to do, and obviously because it's his project and he believes in it. But I would rather hear from other people.
Yeah.
Who were not only involved in the project, but just around it at the time. But going back to what you just said, like, I think you would be right to say this isn't a film that could necessarily be made today for a few reasons. I think one of the reasons that it is such a masterpiece is how much they leveraged that doubt about was it real, wasn't it real? And again, we talked about this recently in terms of the found footage and things like the Blair Witch. Yeah. It's easily verifiable now. So in terms of that, there would have been so little controversy. I mean, all right, The Green Inferno, Eli Roth's The Green Inferno. I haven't seen it. From what I've heard, it's horrendously grisly and gory and quite similarly shocking.
Yep.
But do you hear anybody hoo-haing about it?
Yeah, that's fair.
No. So I do wonder if it wasn't for things like the lawsuit, would it have maintained that reputation that it's got?
Can't imagine so. Yeah, it's a valid point.
Yeah.
It's a valid point.
Can you imagine, like, being in one of the first audiences of this film in, like, 1980, whenever it was released? How mind-blowing would that be? To be so unfamiliar. Well, found footage wasn't a concept. It wasn't that they were unfamiliar with it. It just wasn't a concept.
Yeah, I mean, there was. It sounded like, because it. I mean, this is almost like the missing link, as it were, between.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was based on a documentary, wasn't it? Like, that's the point. Mm-hmm. It was inspired by the creative practices of actual documentarians in their coverage of a terrorism incident, I believe.
Yeah.
So that's the missing link between documentary and found footage as we know it,
Mm-hmm.
Because again, it tried to tout itself as a documentary. There's a reason at the end, there's a caption that says the projectionist who leaked this footage was arrested and fined, or whatever it was, That's the whole point.
He made
the whole point is
so much more money.
They're running with this established kind of narrative of the footage being real and then destroyed by executives, but then sort of squirreled away and released outwards beforehand,
Yeah, because there is that line right at the end where the executive says, "I want this material burned, all of it," and there's a part of me that's just like, "Oh yeah, same. Please, I never want to see this again."
Yeah.
But yeah, so in the second half of the film, then. When it's kind of revealed, when it's made obvious that the documentary crew are instigating a lot of what you see, they're actually committing atrocities against the tribes people, and you get to see the extent of which they've created the savagery themselves. Yeah. How cathartic then did you find it when they finally get what's coming to them?
I mean,
or do you think it was just like so grotty and so horrible to watch that you couldn't get
that was
any
the thing,
enjoyment?
Like I couldn't get any enjoyment out of the whole second half. It was just so uncomfortable throughout. And like with you, I just kind of stopped making notes because I was just like cringing into myself, trying to look away.
Literally losing the will to live. I was like under a blanket on my couch on my own, just like, this is the worst. Why are we doing this?
I came away thinking I've more so than ever, it's just, I don't think there's many films that have made me more uncomfortable than this film.
Really?
Yeah.
You needed some serious brain bleach.
Kind of, yeah. And it's weird because again, it's got all the hallmarks of, a lot of the hallmarks of 80s kind of video nasties, which I would have expected myself to be familiar with, but there was just something about everything going on, the mystery behind it.
This is it, right? To touch on that quickly, I think that's a really interesting point, because there's nothing in this film that we haven't really seen elsewhere. Separately, granted,
and maybe even worse,
and maybe worse. Okay, so it's not normally all in the same film, but I mean, rumour has it a lot of particularly Italian horror films during that time did use actual animals.
Well, yeah,
that were killed on screen. That wasn't unusual, particularly.
And Deodato kind of came out and said, "Well, how come that Apocalypse Now?"
Kind
of touted as one of the best films of all time, can kill an animal in that, and
that was real,
and no one can bat an eyelid,
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's a fair point.
That's interesting. So you think because it's in the horror genre that it was treated a little bit less fairly because it wasn't Oscar bait?
I don't know. I think it's not necessarily the genre. There's a lot about that film that I feel can justify the controversy.
Yeah, I think in terms
more so
of
than anywhere else.
In terms of the animal killing and the animal cruelty, as you just said, obviously similar thing happens in, well, perhaps not similar, but something happens in Apocalypse Now. And the way the BBFC justify this on their own website, which I'm inclined to agree with, you won't often find me agreeing with ratings boards, let me tell you. But one thing that I agree with is that the thing they took issue with in Cannibal Holocaust is that it was so prolonged. Yeah. I think one thing that they allowed animals to be killed on screen for real, but it had to be a quick and a clean kill. Yeah. And I think the thing about this is that they revel so much in the torture. And not only that, but some of the shots are so prolonged, you get to see like the post-mortem twitching and like, it's awful. It's soul destroying.
But then at the same time, it's
so laboured.
I'm not trying to justify it, but there's not a lot of like, I don't think there's any actual torture per se of an animal.
Oh, I think there is. There was was it like a rat or something, and he was sticking it with the knife and.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
That was horrible.
They called it some muskrat, wasn't it? But it was
Oh, that was it. Yeah.
It was a coati or something in real life. But yeah, that's
and
fair.
The piglet.
But like in terms, but then I don't. Again. I don't know.
This shit will haunt my dreams.
It's like again, it's just horrible to talk about. I'm almost like speechless. But I
feel really bad. Like I'm starting to feel guiltier that I made you sit through this.
No, it's fine. I'm just trying to word this in such a way that doesn't seem like it was fine, you know?
Yeah. No, like, I don't think anybody's going to take that tack with you. Like, don't worry.
For example, like the pig was shot and died. The tarantula
it was the squealing when he was being kicked and stuff, though.
Oh, yeah, maybe I've just scrubbed it from my mind.
In that case,
You're probably actually right, yeah.
I'm not going to remind you too much more then because I can't afford to pay for your therapy. Watch a Pixar film.
Always.
Will that help?
Gladly.
That'll help. Just not Up. Not a sad one.
What do you not a sad one? All Pixar movies are sad in some way.
I instantly regret that advice.
Not a sad Pixar film. Have you watched a Pixar film, Sarah?
I'm so sorry.
No, I know what you mean. And I think I am just misremembering because I was like, oh yeah, the pig was shot, the pig died. But actually, you're right. Like there was more to it than that.
So much of it was so prolonged, and I think that was the unnecessary part. Like,
yeah.
Again, I understand his justification for it. I understand that some of it was necessary so that we get to see just how gross these people are and how inhuman in a lot of ways. And when I say that, I am talking about the documentary crew.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, going back to my initial point, I did get a certain amount of catharsis from that second half. I'm not going to lie.
That's what we're talking about.
They were so awful.
They were.
I would rather watch that blonde guy get his dick chopped off 100 times before I would see that turtle get killed again.
Yeah, 100%.
It was nothing less than he deserved. I don't know. I think it was a really interesting reveal, and I think it was quite clever on the part of the director, if I'm honest. I think, again, as we said earlier, this film is so often unfairly maligned and disregarded and chucked on the pile of video nasties, but it had a lot more going for it, and it had a lot more to say than 99.9% of the other films that were on the banned list.
100%, yeah, no, I do agree with that. I just feel it was, again, like I've kind of mentioned a couple of times before, it was undermined because it's like the whole message seems to be outside of the inspiration of sensationalism, but the whole message seems to be who's the real savages, us or them? It's us, but it's also kind of them as well, you know.
Yeah, at the end it's like, oh, who's the real cannibals? I mean, it was the cannibals.
Like
they were the real cannibals, but we were also horrible.
but yeah, also there was the whole like ritualistic rape. There was, all sorts of stuff that went on in that first half that, wasn't exactly, didn't make me feel comfortable.
But so you're saying that's because that's not a fair representation of like a tribal custom in a South American rainforest?
Again, I don't know. It could, without knowing, without looking into tribal customs, it could have been. But if you're trying to create a film in which you're critiquing Western cultures and the practices of Western cultures, then it just muddied that argument, I think.
Do you think there's an argument to be made that it could actually bolster the point the film was trying to make? I'm just gonna play devil's advocate here for a second. That's my thing. Just in the sense that perhaps he knew full well what he was doing from minute one. Perhaps it wasn't that he muddied his own message. Perhaps it was that he intended to rile these people up. I'm not saying it's right. I think it was a mega dick move on his part, if that's the case. And I think it was a dick move anyway, because as we've talked about, it seems like these people weren't perhaps treated as well as they should have been. But do you think perhaps that if he was kind of doing some of this stuff in real life in order to get the footage he wanted, that perhaps that actually bolsters the point he's making, because he is who he's critiquing.
Yeah.
Like, we're all guilty kind of thing.
I don't know.
Like the film, perhaps, like, I keep saying perhaps, and it's doing my own head in. So maybe the film wouldn't have been possible without those tactics.
Yeah, I think it's the type of thing I'd need to, like, sit and think about. But I'm sure there are ways of... Well, no, for example, like... Okay, so the way it was structured was great because... The anthropologist, Harold, comes across these cultures. They are instantly suspicious of him and don't treat him with revulsion per se, but there's a definite tension there.
Yeah.
And obviously it isn't until the second half that you find out why, because...
That reveal to me was great.
Yeah, like that's great, but I think there's... That whole first half, I'm sure there would have been ways of portraying a different culture and the customs of them that didn't lean too heavily into the whole savage stereotype.
Yeah, I guess there's no real argument that you can make for that first ritualistic punishment rate.
Yeah, because if
that didn't happen because of interference from the white man, that was something they would have done anyway. They were doing
for themselves. Yeah,
yeah.
And if I'm sure there could have been situations that they could have come up with that pointed at a different cultures and certainly made Harold and his crew feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But you could still watch as an audience member and think, that's not be okay with it per se, but just to feel more okay with what they're doing and feel like, okay, this is weird, but maybe that's something they do.
Yeah.
But instead they just like double down on this whole like, oh, they're from tribes in the Amazon, therefore they're all primitive and savage, and
and there's no way not to view that in a condemning kind of way. Like, how can there's no argument you can make for support of acts like those. So it doesn't set them up in a particularly sympathetic light.
Yeah, and particularly since the whole interpretation of them was fictionalized, they could have done anything they want.
That's true.
Like, if you're gonna move away from real cultures and make up your own thing, even if they are named after real tribes within the Amazon, they could do whatever they wanted to.
I think that was a misstep.
What, naming them after real cultures?
Yeah. I think that could be labelled racist because you're misrepresenting a whole slew of people who, I mean, probably are just very peaceful and getting on with things.
Well, you don't know.
We don't know. We'll never know.
And that's the frustrating thing, and I think that's why it's so part 3. So why it's such an uncomfortable watch, because you don't know how much how much sensationalism, how much exploitation has gone on to make this film.
And on the flip side of what I've been saying, like, I do think this is, in some respects, a masterpiece of cinema.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to overstate what it is, because yes, it's a film with a message. Yes, I think it's actually constructed quite cleverly. I think it's well put together. I think it's an interesting film. But it is also intended to shock, and it's intended to be controversial. There's not a part of my mind that doubts he knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
So I also don't want to overstate it, because it is it's grindhousey trash at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah. Here's a question.
Oh no.
Don't worry, it's fine. How influential would you say this movie was?
Ooh. That's a really difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
I think it's a film that most people familiar with horror will have seen at some point. I think it's referenced a lot, but it's not like homaged in the same way that things like The Shining or Psycho are. But it is very well known.
Yeah.
It's difficult, isn't it?
This is the thing, yeah, because it's, again, you think of found footage and, maybe Peeping Tom, maybe Cannibal Holocaust would be your go-to found footage movie.
For the first, yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of actual, like, tangible influence, I don't think Cannibal Holocaust did as much for the subgenre as Blair Witch did, because in terms of, like, Cannibal Holocaust was 1980, Blair Witch was 99, I believe. There's 19 years there of like zero films from the found footage subgenre, and as soon as Blair Witch comes out, that's the film that is like, oh, let's do this. And
I'm gonna have to do some digging. Do you think there was zero?
Well, I'm not saying there was zero per se.
But nothing
but
of note.
I'm sure there were, but it didn't catapult the subgenre to the limelight like Blair Witch did. No. And who knows? Maybe that's because the studios
I would make a different argument.
Okay.
I think the thing that did more for the found footage genre was the cost of barrier to entry.
So that's what I was about to go on. Like I was about to say, like, maybe it was the studios picking up on the fact that Blair Witch was made with such a low budget, yet
shoestring.
So kind of huge rewards that, of course, they wanted to jump in.
Because actually, in the wake of Blair Witch, I can't actually name that many found footage films that came out just after. I would say the real turning point was probably something like Paranormal Activity.
Yeah, that's fair.
Almost a decade later, because it was at that point that they went,
that's true,
big
actually.
money here.
God, decade.
Nearly, yeah.
Was Paranormal Activity 2007?
I want to say 2007, yes. Don't quote me on that, though.
No,
but I feel like it was at that time that a camera that was good enough quality to make a found footage film on was so affordable to wannabe filmmakers that they saw that as an opportunity. I think that's probably what did it more than anything else.
Yeah. No, I think you're right there. I think they probably had their own influence in their own specific way. Yeah. Because, like you say, like Cannibal Holocaust kind of brought it into the mainstream a little. Blair Witch had the whole kind of budget versus reward argument going for it. Yeah. And then Paranormal Activity around then was the time in which they were like, oh, literally anyone can make a found footage movie now.
Yeah. Yeah, people can literally make them on their phones these days.
Yeah, so I guess they were all probably, actually, now you mention it, equally as influential, but in different ways.
Yeah, they were all stepping stones to the found footage that we know now, definitely. Yeah. In terms of cannibal films, I think it was quite influential in the immediate aftermath, because there were quite a few films that mimicked it. I guess the most famous is Cannibal Ferox, which I haven't seen. But
I have not seen either.
I own it. I haven't watched it yet.
I'm not sure how much I want to watch that after.
I was just about to say, I'm not in a huge rush to watch it right now. I mean, I watched Cannibal Holocaust this week. I'm going to leave it a month, see if I've recovered, then I'll reassess. Yeah. So I think it's probably a good time to wrap up then.
Yeah.
This is the hard part, though.
Right.
Put into words how you feel about this film, Philip.
A word, conflicted.
Yeah. No pressure.
I didn't enjoy this movie.
No.
I didn't come away wanting to rewatch it. I didn't come away like feeling like it was time well spent. However,
fine fun for all the family.
Yeah, there is something going for it. I think if they'd have, well, as we've talked about, we've talked about it before, but I think if there was a clearer message, then I would have had more kind of appreciation for it. But it just feels like everyone in this movie is a bit shit.
They're
in
all
some
horrid.
way. Like behind the camera, in front of the camera, people are being forced to do things they don't necessarily want to do. Like people are being taken advantage of fictionally and in reality.
Yeah.
It's knowing that animals being taken, like there's just knowing all of that. It's really hard to distance yourself from that.
Yeah.
However, like I can appreciate there are some elements in it that are clever, and there's I can appreciate the fact that it was done with a message in mind, even if the message was, because that sort of movie, again, like any, like Texas Chainsaw, Evil Dead, like so many of those video nasties of like the 70s and 80s, there's no message. It's just, hey, look, blood, boobs, all that, and nothing behind it. However, you
could argue that the message in Texas Chainsaw is don't pick up hitchhikers.
Yeah, I mean,
just
what I mean?
saying. Don't read from the Necronomicon. What are you trying to say? They've all got messages.
You know what I mean.
I know, I'm just being difficult.
Oh, really? I hadn't noticed.
Have you met me?
But yeah, like I can appreciate that this film was trying to say something and trying to critique a practice of journalism that was, from the sound of it, getting fairly prevalent in Italy at the time.
Yeah, and on in a larger sense,
maybe in worldwide. Yeah,
in a larger sense, just a critique of humans are crap. We're all I think this film left me a little bit embarrassed to be a human.
Yeah, I just felt
that's
like,
my review.
Coming away from that.
Yeah, it is a really difficult one to kind of compress and put my thoughts about it into any sort of succinct, linear message. But what I will say, I think it's surprisingly well made. I think it's surprisingly impactful even now. I think it felt a lot longer than 90 minutes.
Yes,
I will say that.
For sure.
It was a very long and arduous film to have to endure. I didn't enjoy it. In fact, I would go as far as to say I kind of hate it. But as you've said, it is a film with merit.
Yeah.
It's a film with a lot of merit. And we've talked about a lot of it, and I think we've been surprisingly positive. I didn't necessarily know what I was going to say before we sat down tonight, and I've been surprised at how defensive we've been, how in defense of this film we have both been.
Yeah.
It's going to stay with me for a long time, and it's given me a lot to think about. And some of those images are genuinely shocking to this day and will haunt my nightmares. And I think ultimately, if horror exists to horrify, then this film achieves that in spades.
Yeah, and and there is the whole adage of art being there to make people feel uncomfortable. And I'm not saying it.
Don't get me wrong. I fucking love to be challenged. I love to put myself through films that are challenging, because I think you there's more to think about a lot of the time. Like, obviously, Rosie and I covered Climax last year, and that's another film I would put in the same category as something like Cannibal Holocaust. And actually, would love to hear your thoughts on, but if you don't want to sit through it, I would also understand.
That was Gaspar Noé, wasn't it?
It was.
So Irreversible was the film that kind of talked about uncomfortable rape scenes, like Irreversible was the one that jumped to mind. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I haven't seen Climax.
But it's one of those films that I hate on immediate viewing, even though I can argue the merits. Mm-hmm. And I say, I'm never going to watch this film again. I said, I'm never going to watch Climax ever again. I watched it a second time that week. And over Christmas, I bought the Blu-rays. Either I'm a liar or there's something wrong with my brain. I don't know. I don't know which one it is.
Passing judgment. That is for you to decide.
Feel free to pass judgment. I don't care. But I think perhaps I am a little bit of a glutton for punishment. But Cannibal Holocaust was perhaps a step too far for even my sensibilities. This has broken me.
Yeah, don't blame you. Which, for saying it's a 20-year-old film.
40.
That's 40, of course, yeah.
What year do you think this is?
I know.
This pandemic has gone on forever.
It seems like it. I think in my head it was 20 years since it was like classified by the BBC.
Oh, yeah.
That was what I was thinking of. But yeah, 40 years. No, the 80s was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
They fit genuinely. Do not. I can't, Phil. I can't cope. Time is a vortex. Mm-hmm. Nothing exists anymore. Are we even real? On that note, I'm just going to go and sit in a corner and think about existentialism, have a breakdown and maybe rock a little bit until my cats come and eat my body.
Less so
because I've forgotten to feed them. And I deserve it. So, this was a weird one.
I think we always knew it would be weird.
It was. I enjoyed talking about it, though. The film was a slog to get through. The show recording this was good, wholesome fun for the most part.
Yeah, wholesome. Sure, why not?
But before we sign off, I would like to say a huge thank you to our patrons. We are hoping to update the Patreon a little bit more frequently. Obviously, if you do want to sign up, it will grant you access to our Discord server where we have a little community. And I think there's 42 mini-sodes currently. Hours and hours and hours of extra content that you can't access anywhere else. But yeah, you guys are the fucking real deal and we love you. We love everyone listening, but we love the patrons more.
Specifically the people that give us money.
But yeah, no, I'm not afraid to give a little favoritism. Whatever. It's our show. We can say what we want. On that note, though, thank you so much, guys, and stay spooky.
Bye-bye.